Gordon Wood is a name that I'm sure is familiar to all of you. He is an eminent Revolutionary War scholar. His most recent book is The Idea of America. Stephen Pincus is a very promising expert on British imperial experience. His tome is called 1688, which discusses many different interesting aspects of what the English call the Glorious Revolution, which ended the Stuart monarchy and replaced it with the Georgians. Gentlemen, I'll leave it to you to introduce your topic.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here talking to people who know a lot about the American Revolution. We don't have any prepared texts. This is going to be a conversation between Steve and me about the coming of the revolution. We thought we would start our conversation, go until it maybe gets tired, and then open it up to you for questions. We are not going to take the position of defending each of our respective arenas. For example, I'm not going to be trying to just defend the colonists against a tyrannical British, and Steve is certainly not going to dismiss the Americans as a bunch of crazy rebels. So we're trying to explain rather than defend. I thought I would start by asking Steve, why did the British, in the middle of the 18th century, begin to tighten up its empire? After all, for the first half of the century, they had more or less let the colonies alone, and all of a sudden, they begin to tighten up.
Well, first of all, let me also say what a pleasure it is to be here. As a British historian, I feel awed by the learning about the American Revolution in the room. So I'll try not overwhelmingly to defend tyranny as a good thing. Although maybe there will be a tendency that way. So the question that Gordon asked is a really good one. Why did British policy in the middle of the 18th century? Okay, great. Why did British policy in the middle of the 18th century seem to change towards the American colonies? And there's three levels that I want to sort of think about the answer to that. Now, the overarching context is a context which should be familiar to all of us, that is fiscal crisis. But I think one needs to sort of parse that, and there are three things that I want to focus on. The first is the national debt had been a problem for Britain and its empire, not just beginning with the 7 Years' War, but since the War of the Spanish Succession. And because of that, there were various moments throughout the 18th century in which the British Empire toyed with tightening up control over its various colonies and dependent kingdoms. And the result of various measures for this, now most of them went away, but the result of various of these measures led to earlier revolts against taxation without representation. When I say that, I'm referring to the so-called Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745, in which the Scots were furious after the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707 that they, in fact, were being taxed extremely heavily. They were being taxed at English levels with very little representation. In fact, the Scots, while being given representation in Parliament in Westminster, their representation was less than that of the single English county of Cornwall. And another moment of crisis of taxation without representation, which happened in the earlier part of the 18th century, was in the 1720s, when the Irish became absolutely furious with the imposition of Wood's halfpence, not Gordon Wood's halfpence, William Wood's halfpence, which infuriated the Irish and led to the great novelist Jonathan Swift to write Gulliver's Travels. But before that, he wrote the Drapier's Letters, which complained that the Irish were being heavily taxed by an English government, he said, without representation. And a similar story could be told about Jamaica, but I won't. So that's the first context. It's a long crisis, about the national debt. And one needs to understand that before 1688, English governments had virtually no debt, zero debt. And by the 1750s, the state of the national debt was about 1.5 times the gross domestic product. That's a big debt. Second point is that it needs to be understood in terms of party politics. That is to say, when we think about the 1750s and 1760s. And there were three basic positions that were taken within Britain with respect to the fiscal crisis. And they were associated with increasingly congealing political parties. So how do you deal with a fiscal crisis? How do you deal with a huge debt? Position one is austerity, right? You try to pay down the debt, and you try to raise taxes to do that. And that was the position associated with a group that a bunch of younger scholars have called authoritarian Whigs. These are the people that we all hear about: George Grenville, the Earl of Bute, Lord North, Charles Townshend, etc. So you pay down the debt by taxing the colonies very, very heavily. Second group is you try to get rid of the debt by fostering growth, by fostering massive economic growth as quickly as possible. And that was a position associated with people like William Pitt, the Elder, Joseph Massey, Henry Seymour Conway, and William Beckford, and the Earl of Shelburne. This is that group of people. Then there's the third group. I mean, what do you do? There's two possibilities. You either grow your way out of debt and austerity. The third possibility is you pretend the debt isn't there or there isn't a problem. And that's the position that's most closely associated with the Rockingham Whigs and Edmund Burke. So there are different ways of approaching the problem, and one has to think about that. And there seems to be a certain amount of contemporary resonance to that. The third, well, I don't know. The third sort of element is that I think one needs to understand what happened to the North American colonies in a broader imperial setting. It's important to understand that at the same time, the same year that the Imperial Parliament in Westminster passed the Stamp Act, they also received the Diwani for Bengal. And why is that important? Well, the Diwani for Bengal is a very, very heavy tax on manufacturers in Bengal. And just to give you a sense, so the average revenue that Britain was gaining from the North American colonies in the 1760s was somewhere between 38 and 45,000 pounds a year. I mean, there's some dispute about that, and Gordon can tell me exactly what it is. The amount of money that the British government was getting from the Diwani after 1765 was 400,000 pounds a year. So it's a huge amount of money, and this has long-term consequences. The effect of these kinds of taxes actually destroyed the manufacturing sector in Bengal. Bengal produced calicos that were being imported into Europe at very high levels, and other forms of textiles, and this sort of taxation destroyed that. At the same time, Britain lowered the land tax in England. So there was part of a coherent tax policy. And finally, and this is just a sort of, the same people, George Grenville, and his many brothers were with one exception, were instrumental in completely radicalizing or transforming the political economy of Ireland. So up until Grenville's administration, Ireland, which had its own separate treasury, was spending a huge amount of money on public works projects. Building roads, building harbors, using the revenue from Ireland to develop Ireland. The same policies which led to the Stamp Act completely eliminated these public works projects in Ireland. Any of you who've driven on Irish roads recently will sort of understand the effects of that. And instead took the money that was being used to use public works in Ireland to try to pay down the British debt, which led to outrage in Ireland.
Well, that's a long-winded answer to a question, I would actually add important facts that the colonies were becoming far more important to the English, first of all, in population. The colonists were growing faster than any people in the Western world, doubling about every 20 to 25 years. And no other state in Europe was multiplying that fast. So that in 1700, there was one colonist, when I'm talking about the North American colonists, one colonist for every 20 Englishmen. By 1770, there was one colonist for every 5 Englishmen. So you have that enormous growth of population. In addition, the trade has become far more important. In fact, I don't have the figures right on the top of my head, but something like 20% of English trade by 1770 is with the colonies, where it had been infinitesimal earlier in the century. So you have that growth of population to add to the concern. And in addition, of course, the biggest thing, and this is what we might just talk a little bit, but not lecture on, is the results of the war, of 7 Years' War, or what we Americans called the French and Indian War. That, I think, changed everything. Although I think Steve is quite right, the factors lying behind strengthening the empire go back to the early 1750s, and at least, when you have efforts to strengthen the empire. But you might say something about what the war of the French and Indian War resulted, the peace. What were the consequences of that?
Well, the consequences from a British perspective, let me sort of lay aside the imperial perspective. The consequences of the British perspective was an intensification of party politics. Why? Because the great hero from the British side of the war, the great ministerial hero, was William Pitt the Elder. After George III comes to power, he imposes his favorite, his close friend, his former tutor, the Earl of Bute, on Pitt.
Well, let me ask you a question about Pitt.